Now it's time to talk about scale and scope. As we have just said, the issue of scale and scope is about the effect of size on productivity. How does size affect productivity? And that is reflected in these two concepts of scale and scope. So, economists typically talk about economies and diseconomies of scale. Economies of scale are such that with increased size, productivity increases and you find yourself being able to produce relatively more. Diseconomies of scale are obviously the opposite of economies of scale. So, you find if you have diseconomies of scale that productivity declines with size and that you find that your output levels do not go up in proportion. So, you might say if you have economies of scale that when you increase all of your inputs in a certain proportion, then you get more than proportionate increase in output. That is if you have economies of scale. If you have diseconomies of scale on the other hand, a proportionate increase in all of your inputs will lead to a less than proportionate increase in your output. At any rate, you can think of economies and diseconomies of scale as simply a question of do you become more productive with size or less productive. What are the reasons behind economies of scale? Well, the simple reason obviously is increased specialization. So, as the size of your plant or your business grows, you can use specialized labor. If you are running a restaurant, for instance, when you start off small, the same person has to double up as both as a waiter and also do billing and probably also do the cooking. If your size becomes larger, then you can hire an independent cook, somebody to manage the front desk and specialized waiters, and you find that your productivity of your restaurant increases. So, that is an example of economies of scale. These economies of scale are typically due to organizational problems which increase with size. As the size of your restaurant becomes larger and larger, then it becomes more and more difficult to manage all the cooks and all the front office people and all the waiters that you have. Now, you might need a specialized manager to do the job of managing all these people. And as your size becomes even larger and you have more restaurants, then maybe you need more managers and you need another manager to manage all these managers. So, obviously, it becomes more and more difficult to manage as your size increases. So, that is an example of diseconomies of scale. Obviously, diseconomies of scale can arise for other technical reasons as well. So, what happens is that most businesses find that as they start off small, they initially experience economies of scale and their productivity increases, and then once they have reached a certain size and they grow even bigger, then they start experiencing diseconomies of scale, and then they find their productivity starts to go down. So, you might say that economies and diseconomies of scale sort of puts a natural boundary on how large a business can be. That is something which is interesting and we can think and talk about it not within this class, but somewhere else. What about economies of scope? Well, if you know that increasing the size of your operations is going to give you higher productivity, then it sometimes makes sense to go and adopt or do things, produce things which are different from your current line of production. For example, you might produce both cars and tractors, because by doing so, by producing these two different products jointly in one factory, allows you to benefit from economies of scale. So, economies of scope is like exploiting economies of scale or economies of size by producing more than one output. Similarly, if you often wondered why is it there are restaurants which sell both Andhra and Chinese food in the same place, the reason is not because they have a chef who is multi-talented, but rather if you have a restaurant and if you have a kitchen and you are producing, say, Andhra cuisine, then it takes very little effort to also produce Chinese. And if you produce both and you have a larger clientele, then the costs of your operations come down. So, that is an example of economies of scope, and obviously scale and scope play a very important part in terms of the size of your business.